Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to participate in this extraordinary event. We have a limited amount of time. I go directly to the subject. Uh, when we analyze the impact of the Stockholm Declaration in shaping global environmental law, we can identify important trends in the last 50 years. I think one of the most important is the evolution from individual rights to a health environment toward a more systemic approach based on the concept of the environment as the collective good and the merging of an environmental paradigm. During a long time, we were largely operating in the sphere of fundamental individual rights. The theory of individual rights has been linked to the notion of person and subjective rights. But we are assisting now to a big change. For example, the Argentine Supreme Court established that the environment is a collective good and that belongs to the community and is common use and indivisible. This is, I think, is a fundamental shift in the culture of human rights. The merging of collective goods revealed that we need a more elaborated theory, and we can identify the following features. First, the good, the collective good, cannot be divided among whose use it. There is no ownership that allows it to be acquired. Rights of actions are only in the form of diffuse or collective standing to use. Second, sustainable common use. Traditionally, the holder of an ownership right may exclude third parties that seek to appropriate the asset. By contracts, collective goods do not grant these rights. Exclusion is not possible, and the legal burden to restrict falls on whoever decides to restrict access. There is a problem here because the common use produces the so-called tragedy of the commons, the absence of individual incentives to protect goods and avoid overuse. This massive use leads to the depletion or destruction of the environment. This leads to the third point of feature. We need a system dominated not only by rights, but also by duties and restrictions on rights according to the protection required by the collective good. There are duties of protections over collective goods and limits on the exercise of individual rights when this has an effect on the common good. We need to harmonize those rights. The Argentinian Civil Code established in Article 14 that the law provides no protection for the abusive use of individual rights when this affects the environment or collective rights in general. Then Article 240 states that the exercise of individual rights over goods must not affect the development of or sustainability of flora and fauna ecosystem, biodiversity, water, cultural values, and landscape, among others, in accordance with the criteria envisaged in special legislation. Fourth feature, in the field of actions, there are an imperative sequence. First, prevention. Second, restitution. And finally, compensation. Preventive and precautionary principles applies first because the environment is very fragile. For that reason, the solution shall not be limited to solve the past, but and essentially to promote a solution focused on the future sustainability, which demands a decision that foresees the consequences derived from it. This is a big change in judicial decisions. We are accustomed to decide about the past, but not about the future. We need more building capacity about this issue inside the judiciary. And five, polycentric perspective. In the field of conflicts, we need to change the traditional approach based on two parties. As our court established, environmental cases demand a consideration of interest that exceed the bilateral conflict to have a polycentric perspective, since the rights affected are several. For example, this idea to solve conflicts were established in a lot of environmental cases decided by the Argentinian Supreme Court. For example, in water law cases. The court recognized an individual right to drinking water when drinking water directly affect people's life and health, but also recognize the protection of the water as a collective good. The court adopt an ecocentric or systemic approach in order to maintain nature's function as a system and its capacity for regeneration and resilience. This means to change the anthropocentric model, which has been purely ownership related, since it considers the private utility that a person may obtain from it, or in view of the public utility identified with the state. The environmental paradigm which manages the regulation of water is ecocentric, or more specific, systemic. And it does not only take into account private or state interests, but the system interest. The court underlined that the resolution of the case require the adoption of measures aimed at the river basin in general and not restricted to territorial jurisdictions, since environment conflicts are not limited from political or jurisdictional division. It underlined that the very concept of river basin is one of unity, in which the water cycle is understood as a whole, connected to a specific territory and environment. I would like to briefly refer another big change in the field of complex judicial remedies. We have a law since the Stockholm Declaration. We have a lot of laws, I think, without a soul. Very often, environmental law is directed at awareness, but not at behavior. This type of regulation are comforting, declaratory, and expose the conflict, but they do not resolve it. So it opens the door to the important role of the judiciary. There are two most mainly positions. One is the self-restraint position. The traditional approach to justice suggests that courts must limit their role. We call it self-restraint position because the accountability of the execution of the international and national laws laid on the parliament or the executive power, but not on the courts. The other position adopted by our courts refers that the courts has down a judgment and orders its implementation to another branch of power, mainly the government. The decision in this case should respect the discretion that the administration typically enjoys in the definition of the most appropriate means to achieve a result. In the case of this kind of procedural mandates, courts recognize the administrative discretion and order the executive to fulfill an objective without telling how to do it, since the means to carry out the objectives are beyond the judicial discretion. For instance, our court orders to design a plan to clean up a river, like a lot of courts all over the world. The decision of the court implies an order of what to do, but without advancing on how to do it. The court may assume the role of controlling the compliance by itself or by delegation to another court. This is another big change because we are seeing all over the world the most important role nowadays is in the implementation of the environmental law. I think in our limited amount of time, it faces big challenges for the judiciary. The first problem is to think about the forward-looking perspective of judicial remedies. Prevention and restoration looks toward the future, establishing processes to restore the environmental goods that were damaged, which requires foresight information. The decision of who the party is in the best position to prevent and restore and other legal obligations are very, very hard. This is why judicial remedies must also be flexible. This kind of forward-looking decision poses the problem that there are no way to precise how future harm be avoided, and therefore flexibility is required. A rigid decision will lose its effectiveness when circumstances change, which is usually the case in the environmental field. Therefore, conditions required by the ecosystem in question should be taken into account to adapt decisions instead of pretending that it occurs the other ways around. Thus, judicial resolutions are based on data existing at the time they are adopted, but conditions can change in the future. The same is applicable with regard to the measure adopted. So we need a different kind of judicial decision. Testing the effects that the decision producing is very important, and we need a forward-looking decision and very flexible. I think there are a lot of changes in the last 50 years, but I think I try to mention or describe the two, which I consider are the most important in the field of the collective goods and in the field of judicial litigation. Thank you very much for hearing me, and I am very, very eager to listen the other participants. Thank you very much.